thank you all for joining us. I believe that Adeline, you're going to give a short introduction to the meeting.
To the Affordable Housing Group? Yeah, I am.
Yeah. Would you like to start?
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, I first want to say just thank you, Adam and Jessica, for this opportunity. It's absolutely wonderful. So that being said, I'll just go through my script, give a little bit of an overview. So our group, the Affordable Housing Group, was formed in 2018 by a group of residents who grew increasingly concerned by demographic changes in media, due in part to rising housing costs, both owned and rented. Senior citizens cannot afford to stay after downsizing. Young people cannot afford to move or stay and raise families. Laborers, service workers, artists, teachers, etc., cannot afford media. Current homeowners could not afford their own homes. Media is a most attractive place to live, but has lost the racial and socioeconomic diversity it once relished. In the 2+ years the group has been working on this issue with residents and council, we have found other communities that have successfully addressed the problem of affordable housing. Maybe not completely, and not all in the same way, but there have been quite a number of success stories. Our group sees form-based code as one important part in addressing media's affordable housing problem. For example, all new buildings include affordable units or housing, flexible mixed-use areas, conversion of office buildings to affordable multifamily housing, or small rental condos for singles or seniors. So those are just a few of the ways that we have thought about how form-based code might impact current zoning and actually make it a healthier form of zoning for media and create the concept of everybody's hometown becoming a constant instead of just a dream.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tamara, I was wondering if you might just give a short introduction to At Home in Media.
Can you guys hear me clearly?
You're a little breaking up, but we can hear you.
Okay. At Home in Media Community Development Corporation was for the most part recently formed, but it also revolves around the affordable housing issues that we have in media. But it's also about keeping folks in their homes that want to stay in media, especially seniors who may not be able to afford adding a bathroom downstairs or getting a chairlift. So or fixing a roof or any other like slightly structural, just little bits and pieces around their homes, and not having to sell to developers or leave a place they want to be. It's also pretty much not necessarily piggybacking, but hopefully we'll be able to do some partnering so that we can make an impact, to include buying property here or buying land to build on to create that actual affordable housing situation. So that's what we're working on at the moment.
Great, thank you very much, Tamara. And would somebody from Fellowship House like to give a quick overview of Fellowship House?
I'm not sure we have any Fellowship House folks here. Oh, sorry.
I think you're right, Karen, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Karen, do you want to give a short overview of what Fellowship House is? Do you feel able to do that?
I'm not the most familiar person with the programs. I really don't think I can. Is anybody here a little bit familiar with what Fellowship House does?
As far as housing goes, they host for Delaware County outside of Upper Darby. They host the first-time home buyers program. They have a bunch of stuff going on for the seniors activity-wise, at least they did before COVID. So that is definitely a place where folks can get, I don't know, between $5,000 and $6,000 for down payments or closing.
Great.
Yes, that's true, Tammy. And in certain areas, it's not all throughout Delaware County. It's
right. It doesn't include,
it's regulated by Right. Well, it's different areas where they can buy houses.
Okay.
Media is not one of those. So it's regulated a lot by HUD. But it's a great program. And the Fellowship House is going through kind of a revamp right now. They're doing a lot of revisioning, an executive director search. So they've got a lot going on right now.
Can I just add, I know of a couple people, who like 10 or 15 years ago did purchase a home in media
In
through the
media.
first time
Yeah.
home buyers program.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so thank you all very much. I really appreciated that. So what I wanted to do is give you a quick overview of sort of how we got here tonight. And this is for as much for the people who are on this call as it is going to be for the people who are going to be viewing this when it's posted on the borough's website. And this will be made publicly available. So through stakeholder and public engagement, there has been we clearly found out that affordable housing was an issue that people really cared about in media, and that there was increasing concern that media was becoming less affordable. So we put together this meeting, which is an informational meeting, to sort of talk about the relationship between zoning and affordable housing, and especially hybrid form-based code zoning. We are not making any recommendations coming out of this meeting. This is really an informational meeting to sort of lay the groundwork, to understand the different sort of levers that one might pull as would be within zoning in order to address affordable housing. You all just introduced yourself. We worked with the borough to identify essentially stakeholders who have been working in affordable housing or who have raised the affordable housing issue recently in media, and brought you all together here so that we can hopefully give you a lot of information about zoning, affordable housing, answer your questions, which we hope will make the rest of the process a lot smoother as we move forward and start making zoning recommendations. We can maybe get ahead of some of the questions that typically come up as part of this process, and at the same time, really get your input and thoughts and ideas about how we might proceed to address these issues before we even start the recommendation process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a presentation. I hope it won't last more than about 20 minutes. But I can talk sometimes, so we'll move through it. Those of you who had to sit through my 45-minute zoning 101 crash course know what I'm talking about. But then we'll go into questions and discussions. I'm just asking that everybody please not use the chat function because it'll make it more difficult for us to share things when we share this out. And this will be posted again on the borough's website, so everybody will have access to this. The topics that I'm presenting here as part of the presentation really came out of the stakeholder and public engagement that we've done so far. And I'm hoping that this gives a good overview of sort of what options are available here and some of the trade-offs that might be associated with that or decisions that need to be made. So really quickly, the project team, I'm Adam Texa with FHI Studio. I've met many of you. Jessica Ortiz is here with us. She's waving in the background there. And Leslie Black is also on the project. She's not joining us tonight, but many of you met her at the first workshop. So a little introduction to affordable housing. I know that many of you are very well aware of these terms, but I think that sometimes it can be helpful to set the stage a little bit by defining these terms and making sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So the first thing is affordable housing, workforce, or what's sometimes referred to as workforce housing. And that is housing that a household can pay for while still having money left over for other necessities like food, transportation, and healthcare. Affordable housing really is often talked about as a percentage of income. So the HUD standard is a long-standing standard of a 30% threshold that is no more than 30% of your income going towards your housing expenses. But I think it is very important to understand that affordable housing takes into, or should take into consideration, the whole bundle of services that you get when you purchase a home or rent a home. And that includes the schools that you can access, the transportation choices that you access, the quality of the house, the open space access, the safety, and many others. And this is really, the really important thing about this is that these things can be very dynamic. So for example, we all know of people who purchase a home in a good school district and maybe pay a little bit more to purchase that home because of the quality of the schools, because in lieu of that, they might have to, for example, send their kid to private schools, and that would have a cost. Conversely, transportation access is another very important part of this calculation. When you have access to public transportation, you may not need a car, and that significantly reduces down your expenses. This is especially true for me because today I found out I have about a $2,000 car repair bill that I've got to pay. So, you know, the reality of those really sink in once you start to look at the details of this. So the next sort of group of terms that I think are really important to talk about are low income, area median income, and cost burden. Low income, when we typically talk about low income households, we typically talk about those who earn between 50 and 80% of the area median income. And I've defined below area median income is the median income in a specified geography, typically a county or a metropolitan statistical area. So the MSA is the Philadelphia MSA, and that includes all of the counties surrounding Philadelphia. What is defined as low income changes by household size. So typically these are standards that are set based on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 person households. When we talk about very low income residents, we typically are talking about those who earn below 50%. Often it's 30 to 50% of the area median income. And sometimes you will hear people refer to those who are paying more than 30% of their income as being cost burden. That's a term that will frequently appear. The next set of terms really refers to different types of affordable housing, and these can be really important to kind of get your mind around. So the first one we often refer to as market rate affordable housing. That is, you know, in a lot of ways what media has been for a very long time. That is, you could find an affordable house for rent or purchase without any subsidy or assistance from a public program. The market was providing affordable housing. The second group is sometimes called subsidized affordable housing, deed restricted affordable housing. There's several terms that go in here, but it's essentially housing where the owner is required by law to rent or sell a unit at a price, usually tied to the area median income. It's called sometimes deed restricted because it actually gets written into the deed that's registered with the county. And you know, there's a wide variety of these types of affordable housing options, many of which are owned by quasi-public entities like housing authorities. And then finally, there is the Section 8 housing voucher program. What's really important about this is that Section 8 is a voucher program. So households receive a voucher, and then they go out and find rentals that meet specific requirements set forth in the Section 8 housing program. So this is sort of a blended approach where the government is providing direct subsidies to renters, and it's only for renters, to find rental properties in the market, as it would be, that meets their needs. So those are sort of a good foundation. And I've done this little sketch here that just sort of illustrates the difference between a market rate affordable unit and a subsidized affordable unit, which I think should be fairly clear. So when we start thinking about affordable housing and understanding affordable housing, one of the first things that we ask as planners and policymakers is who cannot afford affordable housing, or who cannot, access affordable housing. And one of the really important things to think about here is there are a whole diversity of people, and they have different needs and different abilities to access housing. And generally speaking, it is all housing is typically not unaffordable. That the renters will have issues accessing first-time home buyers, elderlies, people, families, singles, specific racial ethnic groups. A group that typically has issues accessing affordable housing can be cash wage earners, immigrants, people who are handicapped. So typically when we talk about affordable housing and we start getting into the details of it, we start breaking it down by these specific segments and starting looking at these segments and what the obstacles are. And then, the question becomes, why do people not live in affordable housing? Why can't they access the affordable housing? Sometimes it's an income issue. You just don't make enough money in order to, find housing at a reasonable price. Sometimes there's just not enough supply of housing, and so there's more demand than there is housing. That can be impacted by development costs. Sometimes one of the core issues with provision of affordable housing has to do with development costs. The cost of land and construction and financing doesn't make it feasible for the private market to supply housing at an affordable rate. There can be demand issues. So these are often in places where areas become more attractive for a particular reason. Maybe a new employer sets up, maybe housing preferences, choice changes, and all of a sudden there are more people looking for housing in that area than there are people who or the housing to supply it. Access issues are a frequent cause of affordability housing issues. This has especially to do with transportation access issues. So all the affordable housing is in an area that is difficult to access or far away from jobs. And then the list goes on. Savings and banking issues. There's a whole issue with, again, cash wage earners and people who don't have bank accounts. Discrimination, both legal and illegal discrimination against people because of in their housing options. And then, inadequate government support for affordable housing programs are all options around or potential causes, around why people can't access affordable housing. And this is a great sort of pullout from the State of Housing Affordability in Philadelphia, done by the Pew Trust, that talked to people about reasons why they were renting instead of owning when looking at affordable issues. So zoning really only has an impact on one of those things, and that is the supply of housing. So the intersection of zoning and affordable housing really comes to a head in the supply of housing. It doesn't impact really demand or development costs or access issues or any of these things, although the location of the supply can, but in a place like Media, generally speaking, it's really about supply. And so how can zoning impact supply? It can allow for denser housing types that are more likely to be affordable. It can encourage smaller units, which are more likely to be affordable. It can place design standards which may increase the quality of affordable housing and make more dense options more palatable. And it can require affordable housing to be included within some projects. All of those are possible, but if you notice, I've underlined these likely, may, some for a reason, and that is because this is really an indirect tool for the creation of affordable housing. So just because you put it in your zoning does not mean that it will happen, and we'll sort of talk about that a little bit going forward. And the other thing is, it's very important to remember that zoning impacts what can be built, but cannot make anyone build anything. This is the old, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. There are a ton of communities out there that have very good zoning ordinances that are very well designed to support affordable housing in a lot of ways, but where there's just not a lot of development. And so there's not a lot of movement in the private market. So there's not a lot of things that the zoning can impact. And I think that's important to recognize. So the first thing I want to talk about is form-based zoning and design guidelines and how they can impact affordable housing. So form-based zoning and design guidelines place control on housing typologies that are typically more affordable, and that's typically denser housing, to make them more attractive to the general community. And so this is an issue that's commonly occurred in many communities, which is a community identifies the need to have denser development to allow for more affordable units, and they meet resistance to this approach because the perception of more dense development is that it is inconsistent with the existing character of the community. This is most often and most frequently found in communities that are largely single family detached housing places, but not exclusively. So one way we can do form-based codes can help is to set design standards to make sure that new affordable housing fits within the character of the community, and there is no pushback in that respect. It can, to a certain degree, address unnecessary cost cutting, basically putting a floor on the quality of design and development that can take place in a community. One thing which we'll talk about is it can introduce new housing typologies, which is to say, permit new types of development which previously weren't permitted, and those new development types, can be more affordable. And then the other thing which all zoning can do, which is to control the impacts around surrounding properties. And so that's talking about parking and buffers and similar things like that. Again, this is all typically revolves around density and increasing density in a community. So the form-based code approach may, like I said, introduce new housing typologies, set standards to ensure denser housing looks and feels more like a lower density context. It can also, to a certain extent, address accessibility issues, so access for people with handicaps. One thing that it certainly can do, and one of the benefits of form-based approaches and design guidelines, is providing more predictability. That way, if as a community you can sort of agree on some solutions to move things forward, the development that actually happens as a result of that is substantially similar to what everybody agreed on, which is not always the case with the sort of traditional Euclidean zoning. It can also reduce the back and forth between a developer and the community during the approval process, which can reduce development costs. And I will get into that in a little bit. But typically, unless you're in a very robust market like New York City, for example, the approvals process is not going to be a major deterrent for larger developments. Where it's going to be more costly is for smaller developments where the benefit coming out, the income that's generated from the development is got a lower margin, essentially. And then, form-based codes have typically addressed parking and it made an attempt to reduce parking demand, which ultimately reduced the overall development costs associated with new construction. So one of the topics that we know has come up quite a bit in media through our stakeholder and public engagement is accessory dwelling units. We know there has been a fair number of applications for them, and that they're seen as a potential solution for at least expanding somewhat the affordable housing stock here. So for those who are not familiar, an accessory dwelling unit is a secondary house or apartment that shares the building lot of a larger primary home. So these are sort of three examples. So I think it's important. The first one that often is forgotten is that accessory dwelling units can actually be included within the home itself, within the primary resident. It can be sort of an attachment or expansion onto the home, or it can be a standalone unit. Frequently, we think of the standalone unit, that's the one that gets the most press, but all three of these would be considered accessory dwelling units. And what I want to go through, and you'll see this with all these recommendations, a little bit of a discussion of the rewards and risks associated with accessory dwelling units. These are general, they're not specific to Media Borough. We have not dug into the details enough to provide you whether or not these are going to happen, and likely you may not know the answer until you actually move these forward. But the rewards of accessory dwelling units is that it can increase the supply of rental housing, and it can increase the supply of smaller units, which tend to be more affordable. They can create passive income opportunities for homeowners specifically, although there's some real questions about that because of the cost of essentially accessory dwelling unit development. And it can create new housing options that haven't otherwise been available in a community, especially intergenerational housing options and very small units. Typically, accessory dwelling units are, in the 600 to 900 square foot range. They are very small relative to a home. There are some risks associated with accessory dwelling units. One is that it may increase the cost of home ownership. And so one thing that I always try to remind people is once you have a rental unit on your property, that unit is generating income, and that income will be seen by the next homeowner as a benefit, as something that they could also capitalize on, which is going to increase the sale price of the unit. So it may actually make home ownership more expensive, especially depending on the degree to which ADUs are implemented. That could have a very negligible impact on the market or a much more substantial impact. And it may not impact the populations in need of affordable housing. For example, if the major gap in your community is access for new families or people who are looking to be first-time home buyers, these ADUs won't address that issue. So it's really targeted to a specific issue and a specific demographic where it can have benefits. So another very popular approach to addressing affordable housing is increasing density in residential areas. And I'm going to walk you through what this will look like. So it is really focused on allowing denser housing that's more likely to be affordable because it encourages smaller units, which are likely to be more affordable. But they can still be expensive. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of why that is and how that works. So what I want to put out to you is a scenario. So there is a theoretical place that is a aging single family home. It's got about 1,500 square feet, and it's a single family home. And there is an opportunity from an investor to think about it either as a rehab, so rehabilitating the home as it is, knocking it down and building a significantly larger unit on it, a 4,000 square foot unit, knocking it down and building a larger two-unit property, so larger than the one unit, but smaller unit sizes, so 2,500 square feet, or building a 4-unit houseplex, for example, that has an overall building size of 8,000 square feet, but the individual unit sizes are 1,750. Okay, so this is a hypothetical scenario. All of these unit types exist in media. So I think it's an applicable case study to sort of look at, or thought experiment to look at. So when we look at the development costs, and I want to really emphasize here that these development costs are generally accurate, but really put out here for consideration and discussion. The first thing is under all three scenarios, the acquisition cost of the property would be the same. Let's say it's $350,000, not outside the realm of acquisition in media. The demolition costs are typically a percentage of the square footage of the overall cost. And so the demolition for all options would be the same. There'd be no, obviously, demolition costs for a rehabilitation of the existing home. Hard costs are the amount of money that you are spending to actually build the unit. They're typically estimated as a price per square foot. Right now, I've assumed that all three of the developments, the 1 unit, 2 unit, and 4 unit, cost about $150 per square foot to build. That's not necessarily exactly in line with where media is at. I don't have to be honest with you, I don't have a great number for that, but it's certainly in line with the cost in the region and will work for our scenario. And the soft costs are usually a percentage of the hard costs, usually estimated as percentage of the hard costs. So that is your architect, getting your financing in line, the approvals process, sort of everything that doesn't actually result in materials. And what you see here are, a different set of costs that are associated with investing in this property. So the rehabilitation is obviously the cheapest. The construction of the 4 unit development is the most expensive because it's a percentage of the total square foot of the building, and it's got the largest building. And so you kind of see what the inputs would be on this. The next thing that we look at is the sale price. So if you had to sell the home at a price, what could you get for it? And obviously the larger units are going to sell more. Typically, the homes are sold at or you can estimate sale price on a dollar per square foot basis. And I went on Zillow and dug around a little bit in media and got a good estimate for basically what you can sell a square foot of housing in media for in new construction. And so all that is the total size of the unit multiplied by that sale price, which is in the neighborhood of about $320 a square foot. So what you get here is the much higher sale price for the 4 units, but the per unit cost, the incremental unit, is significantly cheaper. So if you build 1 unit, you have a sale price of about $1.5 million. If you build 4 units, you're getting closer to 560. So around $600,000 to purchase that home. So significant difference in sale price. But remember, you're also getting significantly less home, right? We're talking about the difference between a 4,400 square foot home and a 1,750 square foot home. So the big thing to pay attention to, though, here is this value proposition, which is the profit to the developer and really the profit to cost ratio here. So one thing that you're going to see here is that the rehabilitation requires a fair amount of investment and does not yield nearly the same amount of return as the construction of a 1, 2, or 4 unit property. So the investment to sort of benefit ratio is much higher for the more dense development, but you're also obviously putting a lot more at risk. And this may help to explain why you'll see more demolitions and rebuilding of new units, even when the older units are seem to be perfectly good. And the key thing here that I want to emphasize is that the unit size is changing along with the price. And so 1,700 square feet is a very reasonable sized home for most people. But as you start to extend this down, and as I'm sure most of you see, this is really looking at 1, 2, and 4 unit construction. Once you start getting into apartment buildings and even more dense development, you will get into even smaller unit sizes, 800 1,200 square foot units. And so it's important to recognize that these then become less accessible to certain household sizes. If you have 5 kids, it is a lot to jam them into 1,700 square feet, along with a partner and maybe, your aunt or your grandmother living with you. That calculation changes very much. It may be, what I commonly refer to is on a absolute more affordable, but relative in the square footage sense, maybe not so affordable. And all of this is to point out that really zoning has the impact on one part of that, and that is the unit size. You can change the density of development on a parcel through zoning. You can have some impacts on the soft costs on approvals. So a more streamlined development approvals process is less costly, and therefore, reduces that sort of, I guess it's the fourth row down, the soft cost there can reduce that number slightly. But zoning really can't change the acquisition costs, the hard costs. If anybody has been paying attention to the news lately, you've likely heard a lot about the cost of lumber and the impact that is having on housing affordability. Zoning has no impact on that. And you can't say, change the sale price. And one thing that I will often say to people is, just because the cost of development is lower does not mean that the developer or the investor is going to sell the property for less. They are going to sell it at what the market demands, and that maybe stay static even if development costs go down. So this is that same scenario. And what happens if there is, I just made an estimate, 125% increase in demand, right? All of the prices go up, the profits go up, but the development scenario and the costs stay relatively the same. This is, I really want to emphasize, an incredibly dumbed down version of this, just so that we can have a conversation. Obviously, everything here is very dynamic. As sale prices increase, there's more demand for materials and contractors and architects, and so things go up. So it's not always such a static situation, but I think it helps to explain the relationship very clearly between zoning and affordable housing, especially in the market rate condition. So when we think about increasing density as a tool to addressing affordable housing, there are opportunities for rewards. You can have the construction of more housing, which can put a downward pressure on housing costs. You can have new construction can be more affordably. That is, absolutely, but again, not relatively sometimes. And you can have opportunities for new rental and housing options. So you expand the density, the amount of density that people can build. They can build different product types, new product types, things that aren't currently existing in the community. And that creates new opportunities for people who maybe were shut out of the community previously because they couldn't find the right housing option. They can now find the right housing options. There are risks associated with this, and I want to be clear that they are real and they do happen. So you can incentivize the demolition of affordable housing by increasing density, and the rehabilitation scenario previously is sort of the example of that. Typically when we talk about affordable housing, one of the factors that is sort of not discussed is the quality of the housing that's being provided. Often, the first housing to go is going to be the housing that is of lower quality and lesser value. And that is typically the more affordable, tend to be the more affordable units. Now, again, this goes all the way back to the bundle of goods that we're talking about. So, one might say that the demolition of a home with a lot of safety issues and hazards, and the production of a more expensive but higher quality home may ultimately be more quote unquote affordable because of the risks are reduced to the homeowner or the renter in that case. Alternatively, somebody may say, hey, it's totally worth the risk to have a slightly more dangerous home or a home of lesser quality for the lesser price. And I'm not going to get in the middle of that conversation, but it's something to be paying attention to. There is an opportunity to increase land values overall. One thing that we'll talk a lot about, I'm sure, is that the zoning that you have on the land will impact what people perceive the value of that land to be. And so, with more dense development, you may increase the overall cost of, or the permitting more dense development may increase the overall cost of purchasing. And then finally, there is a risk of setting higher market prices. As more new development comes in, it sort of sets the upper end, the expectation of what you should be buying or should be renting at in a community. And that then sort of raises the cost of all housing, regardless of regardless of whether or not there's actual value there. So I know that there'll be a lot of discussion of this, and I'm sure all of you have a lot of questions as we're going through. I have one more topic that I want to focus on here that kind of got brought up, and that's inclusionary zoning. So inclusionary zoning is a sort of a tool that encourages or requires developers to incorporate a certain percentage of affordable units in their developments. I really like this graphic on the right because I think it sort of clearly articulates this idea of how most inclusionary zoning works. You have a development, in this case, a 5-story development with 58 market rate units in there, none of which are affordable. You give the developer an incentive, in this case, a height incentive to build more units. In exchange for that, they have to provide 6 affordable units in the building. And, it is always better to integrate those affordable units into part of the development rather than sort of segmenting them off or segregating them off in other areas. Inclusionary zoning is something that communities in Pennsylvania have done. It can be a successful program, but it requires a considerable amount of thought. You have to work through whether you want the inclusionary requirement to be mandatory or voluntary, which has a big impact. You need to sort of assess and determine what are the appropriate density incentives to give to developers. So it doesn't do you any good to give a developer an extra story of development if the developer has no need for an extra story of development. The project's not going to move forward. Conversely, you don't want to just give away an extra story of development in an event that the developer would have done it otherwise. And so you really need to really think through some of the conditions and look at the market as it sits. You need to set what percentage of the overall units you're looking for. You need to set the affordability level. Is this very low income? Is this moderate income? You need to think about the on-site or off-site requirements. So can they developer essentially contribute to a fund to fund the construction of affordable housing in another location? If that's the case, who's going to manage the funds? Who's going to build it? There are a lot of complex questions around that. And then the location. Where do you want to incentivize the construction of affordable housing with an inclusionary zoning? Typically, in communities like Media, it's not going to make a lot of sense to do an inclusionary zoning that addresses single family homes because nobody's got the density there to make it happen. It's really typically in multifamily developments where the inclusionary zoning kind of kicks in. So again, these are generalizations and not specific to media. There are some real rewards to inclusionary zoning. You can get the construction of more affordable housing. It does provide the benefit of being able to target some populations. So you could, for example, require the development of affordable housing for senior populations, for example. And you certainly can increase the supply of rental housing. Typically, inclusionary zoning has much bigger impacts on rental housing than it does on for purchase housing, just because of essentially what's being built, but that's not always the case. There are some risks. So one risk is you may set your affordable housing requirements too aggressively, and you may not produce any results. So the developers may say, I'd rather go build somewhere else. I'll take my ball somewhere and play with somebody else. The other reality is in slower markets, there just may not be a demand for market housing. And so if you don't have a demand for market housing, you're not going to have a demand to construct a building, which doesn't get you any units. The density bonus may impact community character. This is something to really think about. You know, there has certainly been some new developments in media that have different people who have different opinions on it. It's certainly a sort of split on some of that, and the degree to which, you know, the community is willing to support higher density development is going to impact the degree to which they can benefit from inclusionary zoning. And it may also increase the cost of non-affordable units. One thing that I think is always important to remember is developers are playing with margins and they're playing with numbers. And so, you know, in order to meet their non-affordable unit requirement, they say, okay, maybe I'm going to jack up the price of the rents an extra $50 or $100 a month in order to cover my costs. So that's something to think around. Overall, an inclusionary zoning approach really requires thoughtful planning and community engagement. It can be worked within any zoning ordinance, including form-based zoning. So one thing that we'll talk a little bit about is nothing that we will be doing as part of the hybrid form-based code project will preclude the use of an inclusionary zoning tool to be done after the completion of this project. There's nothing that stops that from happening. It is, again, important to remember that inclusionary zoning typically focuses on new construction and denser developments. It does not typically focus on rehabilitation of existing properties. And it does not work with single family housing because you just don't have the development densities appropriate to make it happen.